"Stop that bulldozer!" I screamed, but it was too late. Our HOA president, Karen, was already plowing through my father's workshop, the place that had kept his PTSD at bay since Vietnam. She looked triumphant behind the controls, certain no one could challenge her authority. "Bylaws are bylaws," she yelled over the engine. "This eyesore is coming down today." What Karen didn't know as she demolished my disabled father's therapy space was that she wasn't just destroying some random veteran's workshop. She was bulldozing the personal sanctuary of State Senator James Wilson, chairman of the housing committee that regulated HOAs across the entire state. The workshop had been Dad's salvation after Vietnam left him with PTSD and a permanent limp. Within those wooden walls, his trembling hands found purpose crafting toys for the children's hospital. His Senate colleagues knew him as the formidable chairman of housing regulations. But our neighbors just knew Jim, the friendly vet who kept to himself. "People treat you differently when they know you write laws instead of just follow them," he always said, which is why we kept his political career quiet. But Karen Mitchell, with her designer heels and tablet clutched like a weapon, was determined to improve neighborhood aesthetics at all costs. When she first complained about the workshop, Dad calmly explained it was grandfathered in before the HOA existed. She smiled tightly. "Rules are rules, Mr. Wilson. You have until tomorrow to remove it." None of us could have predicted just how far she would go or how spectacularly it would backfire. The next morning, I found Dad in his workshop, carefully sanding a rocking horse for the children's hospital. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating 30 years of memories. His Purple Heart medal displayed beside Mom's photo. Shelves lined with crafting awards, and walls covered with thank you drawings from kids who'd received his handmade toys during their hospital stays. "She can't really force you to tear this down, can she?" I asked, running my hand along the workbench he'd built after returning from Vietnam, when his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Dad adjusted his reading glasses, examining legal papers spread across his desk. "The workshop predates their bylaws by decades. I've already called my office to pull property records." He didn't look worried. After facing enemy fire and 15 years of state politics, an angry HOA president hardly registered as a threat. But Karen Mitchell wasn't just any HOA president. She'd moved to our quiet community 6 months ago and immediately campaigned for leadership, promising to restore property values and enforce standards. What most neighbors didn't know was that she'd run similar campaigns in 3 previous communities, leaving each after implementing controversial policies and special assessments. That afternoon, Karen's red SUV screeched to a halt in front of our house again. This time she wasn't alone. 2 board members, her loyal allies, flanked her as she marched up our driveway, waving printed bylaws like a declaration of war. "We've reviewed your situation, Mr. Wilson," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "The board unanimously agrees the structure violates our aesthetic standards." Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the weathered wood siding. "Furthermore, we've discovered it sits 6 inches too close to your property line." Dad leaned on his cane, his voice maintaining that calm diplomat tone he used during Senate hearings. "Karen, I have the original property survey and building permit from 1985. There's clear legal precedent, new management, new standards," she interrupted, handing him an official-looking document. "This is a formal violation notice. Compliance within 24 hours or daily fines begin. Additionally, we've hired contractors to address the violation ourselves if necessary. At your expense, of course." I stepped forward, unable to contain my anger. "My father is a disabled veteran. This workshop is medically necessary for his PTSD therapy. The Americans with Disabilities Act clearly—" Karen's dismissive laugh cut me off. "Please. A real therapy requires medical equipment, not woodworking hobbies." She glanced at Dad's limp, then quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the visible reminder of his sacrifice. As they drove away, neighbors watched from windows and porches. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose son received one of Dad's handcrafted toys during cancer treatment, walked over bringing fresh-baked cookies. "Senator Wilson," she whispered, careful that no one overheard. "My cousin works for the housing authority. If you need anything." Dad smiled, squeezing her hand. "Just Jim here, remember? And don't worry, I'm handling this properly." That evening, I overheard Dad on the phone with his chief legislative aide. "Pull the Veterans Housing Protection Act and the recent precedents on HOA overreach. No, don't contact the governor yet. I want to resolve this at the local level if possible." The next morning, I woke to find Dad already in his workshop, packing cherished items into boxes, medals, photos, specialized tools custom-made for his limited dexterity. My heart sank. "You're not actually giving in?" I asked, horrified. He shook his head. "Just protecting what matters most. I filed the legal paperwork this morning, but something tells me Karen won't wait for due process." His instincts were right. While Dad attended his weekly veterans support group that afternoon, I noticed unusual activity at the HOA office across the park. Karen and her board members huddled around a contractor I'd never seen before, pointing toward our property and nodding emphatically. The contractor seemed hesitant, checking paperwork repeatedly, but eventually nodded when Karen shoved what looked like an envelope into his hands. I immediately called Dad, but got his voicemail. His support group meetings were sacred, phones always turned off. Panicking, I texted his aide. "Emergency at house. HOA planning something. Need legal intervention now." By sunset, neighbors began gathering near our property, drawn by the unusual number of vehicles parked near the HOA office. Mr. Chen, whose garden fence Dad had helped repair last summer, approached me nervously. "They're talking about bringing equipment tomorrow morning," he whispered. "Early, before people leave for work. Karen told my wife it would be a quick removal operation." I spent the night on our back porch, watching the workshop where Dad had healed his invisible wounds for decades. Around midnight, he joined me, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "You should sleep," he said gently. "How can you be so calm?" I asked. "Your legal notification won't even be processed for days." Dad smiled sadly. "I learned in Vietnam that you can't always prevent an ambush. Sometimes you just have to be ready for the aftermath." He looked at his workshop silhouetted against the moonlight. "It's just wood and nails, sweetheart. What matters is what we build next." Neither of us could have predicted just how literal that statement would become, or that Karen's bulldozer would arrive not tomorrow, but in just a few short hours. The harsh mechanical growl jolted me awake at 5:30 a.m. Through my bedroom window I spotted it, a small yellow bulldozer rumbling down our street with Karen behind the wheel, her face set in grim determination. I scrambled for my phone, frantically, calling Dad's room, but heard his ringtone down the hall. He was already in the shower. "Dad!" I screamed, racing downstairs and out the back door in my pajamas. But I was too late. The sickening crack of splintering wood echoed across the morning. Stillness as Karen crashed through the workshop wall where Dad had hung his service medals. The bulldozer's metal treads crushed the workbench where he'd crafted hundreds of toys for sick children. 30 years of therapy, healing, and purpose reduced to kindling in seconds. Neighbors emerged from houses, drawn by the destruction. Mrs. Rodriguez covered her mouth in horror. Mr. Chen shouted for Karen to stop, but she continued, methodically destroying every corner of the small building, her face flushed with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Dad appeared beside me, leaning heavily on his cane, hair still wet from his shower. The color drained from his face as he watched his sanctuary being demolished. For a moment, I saw that 1,000-yard stare return to his eyes, the one that appeared during his worst PTSD episodes. "Stop." His voice carried such command authority that Karen actually Paused, the engine idling as she looked up with triumph. "The deadline passed," she announced, climbing down from the machine. "Section 7 of our bylaws allows the board to remedy violations directly." She brushed dust from her designer jeans like someone finishing a routine chore. "I have all the documentation right here." Dad moved slowly, painfully toward the rubble. He knelt, his damaged leg protesting among the wreckage of his life's work. His fingers closed around the now bent purple heart medal, then moved to the shattered picture of Mom. His shoulders began to shake. I'd never seen my father cry, not when he returned from war, not during Mom's funeral last year. But now, tears streamed silently down his weathered cheeks as he cradled splintered pieces of the half-finished rocking horse meant for the children's hospital. Karen was still talking, documenting everything with her phone camera, explaining bylaw violations to the growing crowd of horrified neighbors. She seemed oblivious to the human devastation she'd caused, focused entirely on rules and property values. When Dad finally stood and turned toward her, something in his expression made Karen take an instinctive step backward. His voice was dangerously quiet. "I'd like your full name and contact information, please." Karen smirked, handing Dad a business card. "File whatever complaint you want. Our HOA bylaws are airtight." Her confidence was absolute, the kind that comes from never facing consequences. Dad pocketed the card without looking at it. "I won't be filing with the HOA," he said quietly. "You'll be hearing from my office tomorrow." Karen rolled her eyes. "Your office? What are you, some kind of lawyer?" She laughed, looking around at the gathering neighbors for support, but found only stony faces. Dad simply turned away, leaning heavily on his cane as he walked back toward the house. I stayed behind, fury making my voice shake. "He's State Senator James Wilson, Karen, the chairman of the legislative committee that oversees property rights and housing regulations across the entire state." The color drained from her face, so quickly I thought she might faint. "You're lying," she whispered, but uncertainty had replaced her arrogance. I pulled out my phone and showed her Dad's official government profile page. "The workshop you just bulldozed. It's where he crafts toys for children with cancer when he's not busy writing the laws that govern associations like yours." I gestured to the neighbors watching. "Ask anyone who's lived here more than a year. We keep it quiet because Dad values his privacy." The bulldozer's engine ticked as it cooled in the sudden silence. Karen's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering on the concrete. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "Senator Wilson helped my son when the insurance company denied his treatment. Those wooden toys he makes kept my boy's spirits up through chemotherapy." Mr. Chen nodded solemnly. "The senator helped draft the Veterans Housing Protection Act last year, the one that specifically prohibits housing authorities from discriminating against disabled veterans." Each comment seemed to physically diminish Karen, her shoulders hunching as the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. "I didn't know," she stammered, looking at the destruction with new eyes. "The board approved this. I was just following procedure." But everyone knew the truth. The board was Karen and her two friends who'd strong-armed their way into leadership during the last HOA election when most families were away for spring break. "You should go now," I said quietly. "Dad's chief of staff will contact you tomorrow to discuss full restitution and pending legal action." Karen backed away, nearly tripping over debris as she retreated to her SUV. The gathered neighbors parted, silently, their faces showing a mix of shock and satisfaction as she drove away. Inside, I found Dad sitting at the kitchen table, his hands still dusty from the rubble, making phone calls. "Yes, Governor, it was completely destroyed." His voice was controlled, but I could hear the emotion beneath it. "No, I don't think legislation is enough this time. This is about more than just my workshop." Within hours, the story exploded. Local news vans lined our street by noon. By evening, state networks picked it up. Decorated veteran and state senator's therapy workshop illegally demolished by HOA president. Dad's aide had released footage from our security cameras showing the entire destruction. Dad gave interviews from our porch, always with the bulldozed workshop visible in the background. "This isn't about me," he told reporters. "It's about protecting all homeowners from unchecked authority and ensuring veterans' rights aren't trampled by overzealous regulations." The governor called it a disgraceful attack on a hero who served our country twice, first in uniform, then in office. Veterans groups organized protests outside the HOA office. Karen's real estate broker publicly dropped her as a client. State investigators discovered the HOA's financial records showed serious discrepancies. The emergency account meant for community repairs had somehow funded Karen's kitchen renovation. The special assessment collected for playground equipment had mysteriously been diverted to her brother's landscaping company. The State Housing Authority froze the HOA's accounts, pending a full investigation. Karen's personal accounts were subpoenaed when investigators found evidence this wasn't her first fraud scheme. She'd apparently been running similar operations in 3 different communities before moving to our neighborhood. Dad recused himself from direct involvement due to the conflict of interest, but his colleagues in the Senate fast-tracked new legislation strengthening homeowner protections against abusive HOAs. The Wilson Act would require state oversight of HOA boards, financial transparency, and specific protections for veterans, elderly residents, and people with disabilities. 10 days after the bulldozing, Karen was arrested on multiple charges: fraud, destruction of property, violation of the Veterans Housing Protection Act, and misappropriation of HOA funds. The image of her being led away in handcuffs made front pages statewide. 3 weeks after the incident, I was helping Dad sort through salvaged tools when a line of cars parked outside our house. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped out first, followed by Mr. Chen, the Patels, the Johnsons, and dozens more neighbors, many carrying tools, lumber, and building supplies. "We can't replace what was lost," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her eyes shining with tears. "But we can help rebuild." Mr. Chen unrolled architectural plans. "My son is a contractor. He designed this workshop with special adaptations for your mobility needs, Senator." Dad smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen since the destruction. "I'm not a senator here," he said. "I'm just your neighbor Jim who could use some help." What Karen had intended as an act of destruction transformed our community. People who had barely spoken before worked side by side, sharing meals, supporting a man who had quietly served them for years. Veterans from Dad's support group installed specialized workbenches. Children colored inspirational signs for the walls. The governor arrived unannounced one afternoon, rolling up his sleeves to help raise the roof trusses. "This is what America is supposed to be," he told reporters who followed him. Communities standing together against bullies who abuse their power. Meanwhile, the judge assigned to Karen's case turned out to be a Marine veteran who had received one of Dad's handcrafted eagles upon returning from Afghanistan. Her tearful excuses about just following HOA rules fell on unsympathetic ears. The sentencing would include full restitution, community service at the Veterans Center, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in the state. 6 months later, our neighborhood gathered to celebrate the grand opening of the new workshop. Twice the size of the original, with accessible features and state-of-the-art equipment, it stood as a testament to community strength. Dad hung his restored Purple Heart beside a framed copy of the new Homeowner Protection Act, which had passed the state legislature with unanimous support. Our neighborhood elected a new HOA board on the platform Neighbors Before Rules, promising transparency and respect for homeowners' rights. Their first official act was to create a community workshop program in Dad's rebuilt space, where he now teaches woodworking to other veterans struggling with PTSD. As for Karen, I spotted her last week serving her court-mandated community service, planting flowers in the Veterans Memorial Garden. She looked different, humbled, smaller somehow. When she saw Dad guiding a young Marine's hands as she created her first wooden toy, Karen quickly looked away. But not before I caught the flash of shame in her eyes. Sometimes, Dad told the young veteran with a wink, the things meant to destroy us become part of our healing. When Dad runs for re-election next year, his campaign won't need to mention the HOA incident. The story has spread, showing voters who he truly is. Not just a senator who writes laws, but a man who lives by his principles even when he thinks no one important is watching. Karen thought she was demolishing an eyesore, but she actually revealed something beautiful. A community that stands together against injustice.